here, and with his entourage of angels around him. And then this is Adam. I love this part of the picture as I looked at it. What does this communicate to us? Kind of, what is Leonardo da Vinci, when he painted this back in the early 1500s, what is he communicating? Well, here's what I see. I see a strong hand of a creator reaching out with, even a little bit down, with power and confidence to touch life into his creation. And then I see a very weak creation, kind of doing his best to sort of reach up as much as he can to try and touch God, but he's having trouble. And I think what a beautiful picture of mankind's condition. And many people over centuries have thought this. What a beautiful, creative picture of the reality of God's power to create life and man's weakness, his attempt to reach up to his Creator. But yet God is the one who's doing the initiating and the action in this picture. And Adam is the one who is receiving that action and doing his best to receive that. I just think it's a powerful and beautiful picture of God reaching out to his creation that he has made. I've called this message, "The First Man is Every Man," because there's something very unique about this story, and you have seen this, but I did not mention it yet, that there is a bulletin insert that is there for you if you would like to do this together. I created this so we could just kind of follow along together, and some blanks to hopefully help keep you from falling asleep on me. So we'll do our best. But there's something that I want to notice about this story. It's a powerful story. I believe that it's a true story of what really happened, that there really was a Garden of Eden, that there really was an Adam and an Eve. Jesus certainly seemed to think so, that there really was an Adam. And so I want to say that. However, I believe there is another additional powerful way to read this story. And we are amiss if we miss this, because it is so powerful. And I think that this was also an intention of the biblical author, not only to record a historical fact, but also to tell us a story about ourselves. This is the story not only of Adam and Eve, but it's the story of each of us. So the first man is every man. As we look in the story of Adam and Eve, we can look and see and read ourselves into this picture. We can understand that this is not only our origins, where we came from, but from the moment that we were born and we have grown up. This is also our story, each and every one of us. As you look and as you read this, can you recognize yourself in the faces of Adam and Eve? I want to help us do that this morning. For this story not only happened, this story also happens in each of our lives. As we read this, as we look at this, as we hear Scripture. It's a powerful story of both the past and telling us about our own lives. Right from the beginning of the Bible, we can read about ourselves. We can read, hey, this is the essential condition of how humans were created, of what God gave to them, of what they did in response. And the New Testament makes it very clear that we have all done the exact same thing, that we have all been fashioned the exact same way. And I want to talk about that this morning. We were each created with both an identity, bearing God's image, and a task, ruling God's world. Let me read again 1:26 to 28. It says, God spoke, "Let us make human beings in our image, make them reflecting our nature, so that they can be responsible for the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the cattle, and yes, earth itself, and every animal that moves along the face of the earth." So God created human beings. He created them godlike, reflecting God's nature. He created them male and female. He blessed them and said, prosper, reproduce, fill earth, take charge. Be responsible for fish in the sea and birds in the air, for every living thing that moves on the earth. Just like those first people, you and I were created with an identity. We bear in our souls the image of God, bright, beautiful, blazing within us. The image of God. And so that's why serious disciples of Christ have always been so set on the fact that we have to treat people like people. Because there's the image of God in us. We aren't just cattle to be herded around or slaves to be auctioned off. We are not only the property of the Master God, but we bear His image, that He made us like Himself, that we are reminiscent of the divine, that is in us. And, just like those first people, we have a task. He called Adam and Eve to rule over His world, to take charge, to be His good stewards on earth. He said, this is my creation. We've already read all through chapter 1 that it's very good, all the things He has created. But then He could have left the creation like it was, but He put Adam and Eve here to govern it. He gave them charge over His creation. In the ancient world, not this ancient, but I'm talking about Rome. In Rome, a lot of times there were cities, say Philippi, different cities like that. You've heard the term colonies. Well, of course, we live in America, and you've heard the term there, colonies. The 13 colonies of England, the 13 original states. A colony, of course, is something that is property of another nation or empire. It is an expansion of that empire, but it is not particularly part of the core. So the 13 colonies in America, an expansion of England, but it wasn't England, or different cities in the Roman Empire, like Philippi, like Colossae, things like that. They were part of the Roman Empire. They weren't Rome itself, but they were colonies. The point was, make this like Rome. Bring Roman culture, bring Roman literature, bring classic language. Make it flourish with the sort of culture and dignity that Rome has. Colonize it. Well, oftentimes in these colonies in the Roman days, of course, while this was a colony, it was connected to Rome. Because of that, the Caesar of Rome was still the emperor of that colony. And he found the need to remind the citizens that he was the emperor, that he was in charge, that taxes went to him. And so a lot of times what they would do, the Caesars, they would have statues of themselves built and placed in strategic locations in the colonies to remind people who was really in charge. You and I were placed here to remind one another, to remind the creation who it is that's really in charge. In a way, we're like a statue of the emperor. And we bring his peace, we bring his wise rule to this colony we call Earth. An amazing task that God has given us to care for the creation and, as we know now, to spread the news that God is king. We are those colonizers, I guess you could say. We are those statues to remind of who is the true ruler here, who is the good and wise king. We have an identity. We've also been given a task in our lives. Spread the message of the king, spreading the gospel. Now we each have both fragile and divine origins, of course. Chapter 2, verse 7. Now God formed the man out of the dirt from the ground and blew into his nostrils the breath of life. The man came alive, a living soul. Dirt and divine wind. This is the same Holy Spirit, this is the same divine wind that just a chapter earlier was hovering over the waters of creation. This is God's Spirit, God's wind, God's breath, which creates life. That's a primary role of this Spirit, brooding over the waters of creation to create life, breathed into Adam and Eve to create life out of the dust, breathed into us to create us as living beings, and now breathed into our hearts through Christ when we have faith in what he has done in salvation. We call that the new creation. Paul says, if anyone believes in Christ, he is a new creation. The old is gone, and the new has come. It's because that same Spirit breathed into the life of Adam, breathed into the dust, was breathed into us. We have fragile origins. We're made of dirt. We know it's a cruel joke if we kid ourselves into thinking that we're strong and we're powerful, because we know we're weak and we're vulnerable. God made us that way. He made us with limitations, but he also made us with divine origins. This is, I don't know how well you can see this. The words don't turn out at all, but it's just the text of that verse, Genesis 2:7. Really a neat picture of kind of an artist's representation of God breathing life into Adam, into the dust. So, we are like Adam and Eve. The first man is every man. Here's some more evidence for that. Here's some more ways that we can read this story in a powerful way about ourselves, and that it can inform us about ourselves. Like Adam and Eve, we too experience the goodness of God. We too are recipients of God's great hospitality. I'm going to read again from chapter 2, starting at verse 8, because I think this is, there's some tricky words in here, but I think it's a powerful picture. As you hear this, think about God's hospitality. Think about how he created a world, he created an environment that would not only sustain life, but that would thrive and brim over with life. This vast earth and this Garden of Eden, and how he created this over this whole earth brimming and bustling with life. And he created it to be hospitable to life and to be hospitable to the man. So here in this, the hospitality of God. Then God planted a garden in Eden in the east. He put the man he had just made in it. God made all kinds of trees grow from the ground, trees beautiful to look at and good to eat. The tree of life was in the middle of the garden, also the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now a river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there divides it into 4 rivers. The first is named Pishon, and it flows through Havilah, where there is gold. This gold of this land is good. The land is also known for a sweet scented resin and the onyx stone. Can you just picture that in your mind? What a beautiful creation and how hospitable to life. These rivers. The second river is named Gihon. It flows through the land of Cush. The third river is named Hiddekel and flows east of Assyria. The fourth is the Euphrates. Now God took the man and he set him down in the Garden of Eden to work the ground and keep it in order. We have experienced too the rich hospitality of God. Now, we weren't placed into the Garden of Eden. We know the beauty of the earth, though. When we're out in nature, nature is such an awesome pointer to God. He has made things so beautiful. But also, we've experienced God's rich hospitality in the way that, we don't experience the Garden of Eden because of what's coming next, because of the fall. And yet, the hospitality of God to say, I'm not leaving them on their own. I'm going in with my love to rescue them. And that all we need to do is, like Adam in this picture, frailly, weakly, try and reach back up to God, because he's the one that initiates the action. And he will reach us with that kind of life, that new life in Christ, that hospitality. We too are recipients of God's generous standard of living. 16 to 17, he says, you can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's the only one. You don't eat from it. The moment you eat from it, You're dead. Now that can sound pretty harsh, but I've chosen to see that as generous because this is how God works. He knows and He sees the things that are harmful for us. He understands the way we work because He created us, as we just read. He understands that about us. And He made us with limitations for a reason. He made us the way He did for our best. And He understands there are things out there that are harmful to us, that are only going to degrade us and take away our dignity, things that are only going to cause death and illness and pain. And God is generous enough to say, watch out. Don't go there, or you'll die. Not because He's a harsh, cruel, mean God, but because He knows the things that will take us down. And He wants to save us that pain. So He says, don't go there. Don't eat from it. He knew that it would give them, that eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil would give them the sort of responsibility that they were just too fragile and weak to bear. It was God's responsibility alone to be the keeper of good and evil. And so He said, don't go there. We too have experienced God's generous standard of living, that He's given us a path, a way to live. We too are recipients of God's invitation to partnership. Oh, I wish I could spend all morning on these two verses. So God formed from the dirt of the ground all the animals of the field and all the birds of the air. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. The man named the cattle, named the birds of the air, the wild animals, but didn't find a suitable companion. Can you just think for a minute how awesome that is? That God created everything, but then said, Adam, you're in charge. Your responsibility. Whatever you name these things, that's what we're going to call them. Can you imagine that? God not only created Adam, you know, in other ancient, there are many other ancient Near Eastern, we call them, which means in the region of the Near East, in ancient Mesopotamia, there are many other stories of creation. And this would be also an interesting sermon to talk about how different this one is. What a different picture of God this presents. But here's one of the biggest. In those other stories, almost every time, men and women are created as an afterthought because the gods are too lazy and they need servants to fill in the gaps. They need someone to sacrifice and give them food. They need to be fed. So they create humans, and humans are really, in these other stories, kind of slaves, kind of the drudges of society, and they're created just to serve the gods. Well, in this story, God creates Adam and says, I'm giving you dignity. I'm giving you responsibility. You are a partner of the divine, of me. You are my partner. Can you imagine how awesome that is? We too are recipients of God's invitation to partnership. We talk about the gospel and He says, you know, this is your responsibility. I did the ultimate thing that I could do, the most I could do. I gave my Son, and now it's up to you. Will you partner with me? Will you take this message to those who need it? Will you help one another out and just love one another? Will you care for one another? Will you do the kind of things that I would do? Be the kind of person that I am in myself? We also are recipients of God's gift of human friendship. You know, also as God allowed Adam to name the animals, He was also allowing him to go through the whole creation, search far and wide, and realize, not that one, not that one, not that one. Nope, there's nothing here for me. There's no one. He was also kind of allowing Adam to build up his own desire for a companion. Because it was so good, God didn't want Adam to miss this. So He gave him the gift of human friendship. He gave him a wife, a companion. But as we read this story and think about ourselves, I want us not only to think about marriage, but also just to think about human friendship, companionship, the friendship that He allows us to have with one another. God is so brilliant That he not only gave us a relationship with himself, but he gave us a relationship with one another. He gave us other flesh and blood to be with. I love that. So we've experienced God's goodness, but you know the story. We turn the page to chapter 3. We've not only experienced God's goodness like them, but we have also experienced our own fallenness. So we turn to chapter 3. We too are easily influenced by evil. We too are easily manipulated by others. Eve, so naive, innocent, influenced by the serpent, by evil. Adam, manipulated into evil by his wife. And we're that way too. And again, we're kidding ourselves if we're not. So influenced by evil, so manipulated by others. You know, the world sends us so many subtle messages. How many TV advertisements, how many billboards, how many internet pop-ups, how many radio ads are you submitted to every day? And those plant a subtle message in your mind of who you are, of the kind of things that you should be doing, of the identity that you should be assuming. Well, if you don't do this, and you've not got it quite right, then you're not really living the best that you could live. We don't even realize it, but we are being pumped all the time with toxin, telling us lies about who we are. And we are so manipulated by that in ways that we don't even know. We too are like this. We too have each chosen rebellion over obedience. It says that when the woman saw the tree and it looked like good eating and realized what she would get out of it, bam, she was done. She took it. It looks good. But we choose rebellion over obedience. We too are that way, aren't we? We all know we are. We all know we have chosen rebellion so many times over obedience to the things God have told us. We too have each chosen shame over vulnerability. Verse 7. Immediately the two of them did see what was really going on. They saw themselves naked. So they sewed fig leaves together as makeshift clothes for themselves. Uh-oh. We're not good enough the way that God created us. We're ashamed of ourselves. And so we will hide. We'll hide from one another. We'll hide from God. When they heard the sound of God strolling in the garden in the evening breeze, the man and his wife hid in the trees of the garden, hid from God. God said, "Where are you?" The man said, I heard you in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. And God said, "Who told you that you were naked? Did you eat from that tree that I told you not to eat from?" How often have you and I eaten from this tree? How often have we chosen shame over vulnerability? Because you see, sometimes we think that it's weak to be vulnerable. We shouldn't be vulnerable with one another. We've got to, we're a culture of rugged individualists, and we've got to hide our pain. Don't let them see you cry, right? How many of us heard that growing up? And yet, God made us vulnerable. He made us that way. He made Adam and Eve naked. He made them with limitations. He made them not to eat from the tree. He made them to be together and share their hurts and laughs and cries and pains. But we reject vulnerability. And so instead we choose shame. We choose to live in our shame. And we reject the fellowship of God Almighty. And we choose to hide from Him, just like Adam and Eve did. And so, we receive... wait a minute. Oh, I'm sorry. And we have chosen blame over responsibility. Well, God, it wasn't my fault. That woman that you made for me, let me tell you about that woman. She gave me that apple. She's the one, God, you should be turned to, not me. This wasn't my fault. It was hers. Eve, what'd you do? No. this thing, this serpent, he was the one. It's him, not me, God. Him that you need to turn to. No personal responsibility, but blame. How often do we do that? Well, it's not my fault that this happened. I can't take responsibility because, it was, I don't know, what exactly? And think of an example. There are millions of examples. Think of this country. Think of how, it's not, I don't want to take responsibility. I'm on a system that I can get fed from elsewhere, and that personal responsibility that God created us for, to work the garden, it says. Yet instead we choose to blame one another. So, here's the thing. We pass along pain and death to the next generation. Here's the interesting thing about God's curse, and I'm not going to read it, or what we call the curse. God curses the snake. If I'm right, and I have to look at this again, I think he curses the ground, but he never curses the man or the woman. Despite the fact that it was their fault, he does not curse them. But they do have, of course, consequences. Again, not because God is mean and brutish or nasty, but because he knows the things that are good for us. And Adam and Eve didn't choose those things. They chose the things that degraded themselves. They chose the things that sent them down the path towards death. And death was the result. Pain was the result. And there's a verse that hit me as I was reading that I've never really thought about before. It seems like it kind of breaks up the flow of the passage, and you think, because then God gives the curse, and then it goes back to talking about what God did for them and drove them out of the garden. But in the middle of it, it seems like it kind of breaks up the passage. Why is this here? Chapter 3, verse 20. The man, known as Adam, named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all the living. It hit me like a lightning bolt when I was reading. What a profound statement this is. Now that we've fallen, now that the curse has come, now that we've brought this on ourselves and put this on our own head, now, guess what? Eve is the mother of all the living. Every one of us who are sitting here today, Adam and Eve, this same stuff plagues us. Not just because Eve took the apple, not just because Adam also took the apple, but because each of us have taken the apple. Each of us have done these things. And so it passes on from generation to generation to generation. You talk to my wife, Anna Lee, my friend Finney who's here, talk to Gene Wilson, anybody who's done some counseling and some therapy, Pastor Ray, and will not hesitate to tell you the ways that it passes from generation to generation in a family. Something that's just ringing them down. And yet it seems like the next generation goes to the same daggone thing. Because it's just kind of genetic. It's just kind of who we are. We learn from our parents, who learn from their parents, who learn from their parents to eat the apple. That's what Adam and Eve passed on to us. But God decreed good news. Look at chapter 3, verse 15. Well, I'll read it to you. I guess I'm in the Message. It sounds a little bit different, but it says, he curses the snake. He says, I'm declaring war between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will wound your head, and you'll wound his heel. It's expressed a little different ways in different translations. But the point is this. From the very beginning, when things were falling apart, when the walls were starting to cave in, God stepped onto the scene, put out his hands like this, and said, I read this passage as this way. God stepped onto the scene, put out his hands, held up the walls, and yeah, he's angry. Yeah, he's upset, but he's saying, I refuse. I refuse to let this project fall in on itself. And with my love, I will work with these people, and I will redeem them and bring them back. That's what he's saying. Eve, There will be a seed that will come from you. And yes, his heel will be wounded by the snake, but he will strike the serpent's head. Romans chapter 16, verses 20 says, very soon now, the God of peace will crush Satan under your feet. That's exactly what happened at the cross, and that is exactly what will happen when Christ, for good, when Christ comes again. This is the good news, that we too, like Adam and Eve, have received the merciful sacrifice of God in response to our crimes. You say, where did Adam and Eve receive God's sacrifice? Right after that verse about Eve becoming the mother of all the living, verse 21. God made the leather clothing for Adam and his wife and dressed them. What's leather made out of? Cattle skin. Where did that come from? God had to kill and sacrifice life in order that Adam and Eve might live. In order that Adam and Eve would be given restitution. Right here, we see the first sacrifice, the first bloodshed. Because of us, we have no one to blame but us. We too have received that kind of sacrifice on the cross. We've all chosen exile from God's good world. It says that he drove them out of the garden, which also was in itself an act of mercy. That they didn't have to go on eternally living this way, in this state. We too have all chosen exile from God's good world. But you and I have received, through Christ, what Adam and Eve were only promised back in 3:15. The opportunity to walk back into the Garden of Eden again. Here's an artist's representation of a city. I really like this. I'm not a big city person, but I just love this image. Revelation ends with a city. Here's the cracked ground, the city that's dilapidated. It's under our fallen sort of human standard of living, the way that we've chosen to run ourselves, the laziness, the pain, the hurt that we pass on. But there's God shining in the background. And now grass is growing up through the cracks of that dirt. The sky is clear. God has stepped in to redeem. And through Christ, we have walked back into the Garden of Eden. That's why he says, you're a new creation. And the new creation is on its way. It's amazing. And there's only one way we know. There is only one way that happened. And it was through the cross of Christ. And so I'm going to have my friend Jeff come and read a passage for us from Romans chapter 5. It's about the story of Adam and the story of Christ. It's about the differences between the two. And it's how Christ reversed the curse. How Adam exiled us from the garden, and how Christ brought us back. So, let me get this for you, Jeff. Sorry about that. Yep.